What's up, Theory Creeps? Welcome to the Theory Creep. This time we're going to be talking about the movie Us. It just came out this year. I think it was pretty popular. I don't know. I kind of live under a rock. And I think that the film expresses a lot of the themes that this channel kind of plays around with, specifically the suppression of representation, the privileging of originality, and also the panic around the replacement of originality with representation. Now, Us isn't unique in dealing with this fear of replacement. This is something that goes back well before the beginnings of film. You know, you have like myths of the doppelganger and a general fear of reflections in mirrors. Mirrors have been associated with the supernatural for a pretty long time. And then you've got the more modern panic around photographs and film stealing your soul. So for a pretty long time, we've had these fears of replication and these fears that a representation of ourselves kind of undermines the supremacy of ourselves. We can talk about 4 other movies that address these fears of representation. Look at Invasion of the Body Snatchers. That's a pretty classic one, right? And in that, you've got people being replaced by aliens who look like them. So that's a pretty straightforward fear of representation, fear of repetition, fear of replacement. You've got John Carpenter's
The Thing,
which is less of like a fear of replacement, so much as just like a fear of a version of yourself that is like recognizable, but also kind of different. So the monster in
The Thing
looks like the people that it's killing, like it has the ability to take on the appearance of someone else, and that's where a lot of the horror of the monster comes from. The fact that it looks like you while it kills you. Then you've got more subdued movies like Moon, where the panic is that you are yourself a representation. The fear in Moon is that there is no originality, that the main character is and always has been a repetition. You see something similar in David Lynch's Muhullan Drive, where the protagonists seem to swap places throughout the movie. One protagonist doesn't know who she is, and she kind of adopts the personality of the other. There's this fear of repetition, a fear of replacement, in kind of this like dream-like way where you identify with someone and then you become them and then you destroy them. Fundamentally, all of these movies are addressing the panic around replacement, the panic around repetition. A copy of a person replaces the original version of that person. Postmodern thinking gives us a lot of tools to understand why repetition and why representation might be so terrifying to an individual who is otherwise, you know, the supreme sovereign of their lives. You know, we walk through our lives thinking that we're in charge, that we are agents, that we have control over what's going on around us. And representations, they make us wonder if we are ourselves repeating something or following a script. When we are repeated, we're less original, less sovereign, less in control. In postmodernism, specifically in poststructuralism, this manifests as a privileging of speech over text, or a critique of the privileging of speech over text. Basically, speech in postmodern, poststructural thinking is the stand-in for the original. It's a stand-in for the sovereign. It's self-generated. It's self-sustaining. All right, let's get right down to Us. And before I do, I should say, the same way that I spoiled those 4 films I mentioned earlier, I'm going to spoil everything in Us. Like, this is a critique of the film. I'm not trying to review it and get you to watch it. I'm assuming you've already seen the film. The shadows in Us, as they're called, the monsters, the repetitions, they're representations, which is to say they represent. They present again the original person who they're mimicking. So in Us, this fear of representation replacing original is literally played out. That's literally what the film is afraid of. It's afraid of someone who has been repeating you for your entire life, eventually deciding that they're going to become you. So this is exactly what representations do in post-structural theory. Authors like Derrida call the tendency to privilege or origins logocentrism. And for him, it was all about speech versus text, original speech versus repetitive text. And we should spend a second talking about what exactly is meant by logocentrism. Logos is obviously not a term that we use very often today, so let's break it down just a little bit if you're not if you don't have like a philosophical background. So logos is a Greek word, and it has a lot of meanings, like a lot of ancient Greek words. But the two important ones for the post-structural readings of the term are speech and reason. So the idea here is that speech and reason are tied together. And this matters because it's locating truth. It's locating logic and reason, the traditional tools for arriving at truth, in speech, not in text, which is a problem for post-structuralists because they see this as a hierarchy. And more than just any hierarchy, they see it as a fundamental hierarchy that's at play in almost all other hierarchies. Across Western culture, we privilege individualism, originality, we privilege the authentic, and we always locate it in a singular, discrete entity. And that discrete entity is called, in semiotics and structuralism, the signified, or the represented. And it's represented by the signifier. These are just really fancy words for extremely basic concepts. The signifier is the word, and the signified is what the word is about. So the word cow is the signifier. The animal cow is the signified. And traditionally in Western culture, we locate the truth of the world. We locate authenticity in this pair, the pair of the word cow and the animal cow. The authentic part of that pair is the cow, the real cow. The word is a representation of the cow. It comes after. But what post-structuralists and deconstructionists want you to think about in this relationship is that the understanding that we have of the signified, the cow itself as an animal, is understood through language. We access the world through representation, which means that the world as we encounter it is representational. This panic is what movies like Us and Moon and Invasion of the Body Snatchers is representing. Where we see the original, where we see the authentic, we may actually be seeing representation. We may actually be seeing a repetition. And if that's the case, then everything is repetition. There is no originality. And maybe we ourselves are just a representation. We're not as original, as sovereign, as in control as we might otherwise want to be. Us represents this link between representation and agency really well. The film manifests at least two instances of free will problems that I can think of. One is when the son backs up into the fire, or he backs up into the road, and the other son, the shadow son, backs up into a flaming car. And then the other one is when the husband bangs his own head against a boat that he's trying to climb up into, and his shadow self bangs his head also and falls off of the boat. So this film is concerned with agency. It's showing us that representations don't have agency. They follow originality. But this gets questioned later on in the movie and complicated, but we'll get to that later. For now, let's stick to logos and this Greek idea of speech and originality being the access to a singular and discrete understanding of truth. For Plato, the person who really articulated these ideas clearest, the logos, the world of originality, was outside of the material world. There's the material world right here, and then over there, there's logos. And the world of the logos is unchanging, it's static, unlike the material world, which is always in flux. And the world of the logos, there's only one, and this is really important, there's only one of everything in the world of the logos. There's only one chair. There's only one table. There's only one apple. There's only one cow. And the material world is rife with reflections of that one original thing. So in the material world, there are many different chairs, and they all correspond in some way to this perfect chair in the world of logos. For Plato, there's also a third space, which he puts after the material world. So you've got logos, the material world, and then what Plato calls the world of the shadows, which is interesting because that's also a term that gets used in Us. For Plato, the shadows are best understood through the allegory of the cave, which is the story that he tells about this culture of people that lives underground. And the only light in their world comes from the mouth of the cave. And everything they see are shadows cast by the things in the real world. So a deer runs by the mouth of the cave, and a shadow gets cast on the wall of the cave, And the people in the cave think, oh, that's a deer. But no, it's not a deer. It's actually a shadow of a deer. So for Plato, the shadows, the realm of the cave, is the realm of representation. Even though the material world represents the logos, there's like poems and pictures and statues, and these things are representations of a representation. They're shadows of shadows. And for Plato, representations in the form of like art and literature are evil. They're confusing and they distract us from the logos. Like we're looking in the wrong direction, right? Like we're here in the material world. We should be looking at the singular true world, not the even more confused world of art. In fact, in Plato's Republic, his utopian culture, he says that he will kill all the poets. So Plato is fucking serious about hating representation. This is also a hierarchy. I've been explaining it linearly, but it's also, is top down. Logos, material world, representational world. And again, we have this hierarchy in us. There's the original world, above ground, and then there's the lesser repetitive world below ground. But the same way that post-structuralists confuse this hierarchy using speech, us confuses it using, we'll talk about that in a second. So the shadows aren't the only repetition in us. The film is actually obsessed with repeating images, with identical images laid out on screen. There's a word for this. Let me look it up real quick. Right, it's called trypophobia, and it's the fear of repeating patterns. So this film was extremely trypophobic. You've got the repeating bunnies at the beginning of the film. You've got the seagulls on the beach. You've got the twins on the beach.
Why don't you pee in the ocean? Jinx, double jinx, triple jinx, blackout.
You've also got this weird scene where a frisbee lands on a beach towel that has circles on it that are exactly the same size as the frisbee, and the frisbee lands perfectly on top of one of these circles, which is literally like, an instance of something being replaced by its replicant. You've got mirrors all over this movie. You've also got this reoccurring motif of 1111, which is, one number repeated by another number. Repetition is just everywhere you look in this movie. So the shadows are trying to replace the people that they represent. And this should remind us of the panic that we all feel about representation and repetition. But what exactly the replicants are doing in us is pretty interesting, because they're not directly repeating what the people who they represent are doing. For one thing, they don't dress the same as them. They wear different clothes. They don't act the same as them. They don't take over their old lives like they do in Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And this all stems from possibly the most important repetition or replacement in the film. And that's when the protagonist, as a little girl, is kidnapped by her shadow and replaced by her shadow. Her shadow locks her in the cave, in the shadow world, and goes out into the real world to live as her. So this is a literal repetition, a la Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And it corresponds to a pretty simple panic about me being replaced by my representation, that spoken language will be replaced by written language. But that's not what postmodernism is trying to do. Postmodernism isn't elevating text above speech and rearranging the hierarchy. It's contaminating the hierarchy. It's trying to dismantle the hierarchy and make it more egalitarian. It's trying to show that text creates speech, and that speech creates text, and that these things mix in each other, and that we can't elevate one over the other. So how does us represent this postmodern project? Well, it does so through the entire film. The whole plot of the movie is actually a manifestation of this postmodern agenda to contaminate speech and text, to contaminate origin and representation, not to replace them. See, the first replacement that happens in us is a classical one. A and B switch spots. Done. That happens before the movie starts. The plot of the movie is the revenge of the origin. The original woman has grown up in the shadow realm, and she has become the kind of de facto leader of the shadows. So when we see the shadow world before the original girl comes into it, everyone in it is wearing like similar clothing to what the people above ground are wearing. They're wearing like messy, shitty versions of the same thing. And they're doing what their original person is doing as well. When their original person is on a roller coaster, they're pretending to be on a roller coaster. When their original person is walking down a street, they're walking down a street. This stops being the case after the protagonist shows up in the shadow world. Everyone starts dressing the same. They all start carrying scissors, which I thought was strange as I was watching the movie, and I realized that scissors are a double blade, like it's another repetitive motif. They could be carrying a knife, but a scissor is two knives. Now, the original protagonist turned shadow calls this the untethering, where the shadows, where the representations stop following that which they represent. This also happens in postmodernism. She calls it the untethering. We tend to call it the hyper-real or meta-representation. Basically, it's this idea that simulation has stopped referring to that which it simulates. Basically, we're in a culture that's so steeped in representation that at this point, representations are just representing representations. There is no original anymore. So in the shadow world, before the little girl came downstairs, the relationship between representation and represented was pretty straightforward. Representations were underneath that which they represented, and they just imitated them poorly. This all changes. This little girl is kind of a postmodern figure. She's like a postmodern messiah. She brings these ideas of hyper-representation and hyper-reality down into the cave, and then the cave comes up and replaces the original world. But it's not a one-to-one replacement. It's not like the people from the shadow world come up and just start living like regular people do. It's a complete realignment of the old hierarchy. Now there is no up and down. Now everything is in a row. And we see this in the Hands Across America motif. Again, it's a repetitive pattern. It's egalitarian, it's horizontal instead of vertical. And this fear corresponds to the modern kind of panic around the internet, that digital and virtual spaces won't just replace the material world. They won't just mimic the material world. They'll invent a new world that will supersede the material and make everything representational and everything digital. This is literally what's happened in Us, and I think it's what people like Faye Alberti and Chris Hedges are afraid of happening in the real world. I just want to close on this image. It's the bunny stepping in front of the picture of the bunny. I think this is really indicative of what's going on throughout the movie and also what's going on in modern culture. You've got a picture of a bunny, and then a real bunny steps in front of it and then hops off screen. Two things are happening here that I want to draw attention to. One, we see the representation first and last. The original bunny moves through the picture. It is temporary. The representation doesn't change. It stays where it is. This is a complete reversal of how Plato saw the shadow world and representation, because he saw them as moving and changing and being impermanent. The other thing that I want to draw attention to is that this bunny has just jumped out of the shadow world. This bunny is of the repetitive world. For all we know, there's one bunny for every bunny upstairs, the same way there's one person for every person upstairs. So this bunny is a representation stepping in front of a representation of a bunny. There are no original bunnies on screen in this shot. In the reality of the film, nothing we're seeing is real. Everything we're seeing is representational at this moment. So I'll just leave you with that. Just bunnies all the way down. Nothing but simulation, no originality, no origins, no authenticity. Just layers and layers of representation falling over a void. This has been The Theory Creep. Hope you enjoyed it, and tune in next time for more theory creeping.